Good evening or good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar discussion of Suppress the Fight to Vote. Over the next hour, we'll be in conversation with the director of the film, Robert Greenwald, and a number of faith advocates to help us understand how voting rights are under attack and how we as people of faith can act to ensure that our elections are safe, free, and fair. My name is John Hill, and I'll moderate the conversation tonight. I serve as the Deputy General Secretary at the United Methodist Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C. We are joined by our General Secretary, the Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow, and my colleagues, Dr. Jesse Smith, the Senior Executive Director for Research Planning and Spiritual Formation, and the Reverend Genia Moore, the Director for Civil and Human Rights. I wanted to start just by giving a brief overview of our agenda for our time together. Following an opening prayer, we will hear a reflection on how voting rights has been and continues to be a matter of justice and faith. We'll then have a conversation with the film's director, followed by a discussion on the current landscape of voting rights and how faith communities are engaging. We'll be given an invitation to take action, to put our faith into action, and then open the conversation for a time of questions. So as you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to enter those, and then we will reflect those questions back after the panel conversation and invitation to action. With that, I'm honored to briefly introduce you to our presenters. They each bring a rich history and perspective to this topic, and unfortunately, for the sake of time, I had to compress their amazing biographies into a few short sentences. We have with us tonight the Reverend Dr. Sharon Austin, who currently serves as the Director of Connectional and Justice Ministries with the Florida Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. We're also grateful for Sharon's leadership on the Board of Directors and as the Secretary of our General Board of Church and Society. Robert Greenwald is the founder and president of Brave New Films, which is a nonprofit film and advocacy organization whose work is distributed free in concert with nonprofit partners and movements in order to educate and mobilize the public for change. The Reverend Dr. D. Anthony Everett is the first African-American pastor of Church in the Circle, University Circle United Methodist Church in Cleveland, Ohio. Prior to coming to Ohio, Anthony served as the Associate Director for New Church and Congregational Development with the Kentucky Annual Conference, and had a specific focus on revitalizing African-American churches and ministries. And joining Anthony for our panel conversation is Sister Quincy Howard. Sister Quincy is a government relations specialist with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. She's a professed Dominican sister of Sinsinawa. And here in DC, she also helps lead our interfaith collaboration on voting rights and elections under the banner of Faithful Democracy. So I want to thank each of our presenters for being with us. And now as we turn to our program, we want to begin with a word of prayer from our General Secretary, the Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow.
It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and I'm so grateful for all the panelists and all the participants, and particularly to Mr. Greenwald for such a fine production and documentary. I am sitting in Georgia right now, and so some of this is very close to home, and thank you for your faithful witness. We know that our allegiance to God takes precedence over our allegiance to any state, and we acknowledge the vital function of government as a principal vehicle for ordering our society. We know ourselves to be responsible to God for social and political life. In the United Methodist hymnal, there is a hymn that I will read 2 verses of as our prayer this evening. It's not a hymn that we sing very often, and the title of it is "We Utter Our Cry." So in these particular days of great injustice, I would offer this prayer this evening. We cry from the fright of our daily scene, for strength to say no to all that is mean. Designs bearing chaos, extinction of life, all energy wasted on weapons of death. Come with us, Lord, love in protest and march, and help us to fire with passion your church, to match all our statements and lofty resolve with being unresting in action involved. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Susan. First up tonight, we have with us the Reverend Dr. Sharon Austin, and she's joining us to help frame our conversation really as a matter of justice and faith. As we saw in the film, as we read in the news, as we experience in our communities, there are a number of tactics used today that aim to suppress the vote among Black, Native, and people of color. We know these efforts are the latest in a long history of racist policies that stretch back generations. So Sharon, I'm hoping you might share a bit of your experience in the work to secure and safeguard the right to vote, and how you approach voting rights as a matter of justice and faith. And I think, Sharon. There we are.
Good evening, John. Thanks so much. The right to vote is one that has been impressed upon me from my earliest childhood. And I'm fortunate to be able to recall times when I heard my parents addressing their concerns about voting, meaning the candidates and their platforms. And so an image and a recollection that I couldn't fully appreciate as a child is to have grown up in a household where my parents were able to vote and where they were fairly analytical about their choices of candidates. Later, I can recall the experiences of them supporting certain candidates for a variety of reasons. And I continue to look back fondly and appreciate their commitment to local elections that they could see firsthand affecting the quality of life and schools, which were very important to them. And the difference it makes when one has the opportunity to grow up with that culture.
And Sharon, as you have journeyed over the years, can you share a little bit about some of the engagement that you have had in sort of a historic witness and recollections of some historic witnesses around the long-fought fight to secure voting rights?
Absolutely. Many of you know that I was ordained as a Baptist minister 40 years ago, and actually began my journey in the church on the staff of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And it was my deep honor to participate in the 20th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery. Now, when you are a young adult and often filled with hope, you really do think you are participating in an event as more of a memorial to those who fought the fight, in this case 20 years earlier. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., now Congressman John Lewis, and so many other freedom fighters. Little did I know that I would embark that journey of walking the approximate 50 miles between Selma and Montgomery to jeers along the way, and even people tossing debris at the marchers as we sang freedom songs and stopped along the way to pray. I will always remember what it was like to stand on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where 20 years earlier, John Lewis sustained life-threatening injuries. And it helped to frame both my work as a justice champion and a voice for justice, But it also reminded me and continues to remind me that the right to vote cannot be taken for granted. All of these years later, I have 4 young adult children, and 3 of them are older now than I was when I made that journey, but they will tell you that I take voting very seriously, the platforms, I have the sample ballot out, we're in conversation, and I want to hear from each of them that they indeed did vote in every possible election, ensure that they were registered to vote. I registered to vote when I was in high school, meaning in my high school, they actually made that available. And so it's just been a part of who I have been over the years. And, you know, even as recently as 2013, the US Supreme Court, you know, changed some of the key components of what we now know, of course, as the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that act was significant because the original march from Selma to Montgomery resulted in that act. And we don't want to come perilously close to losing those hard fought rights as we remember those who gave their lives for them, which is depicted even in the film. The threat of voter suppression still looms with us today.
And Sharon, more recently, I know in your leadership role within the Florida Annual Conference, you were part of a campaign, successful campaign to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated individuals. How did United Methodists and people of faith respond to that work? And I'm wondering if you could also maybe highlight how even after an overwhelming vote by the people of Florida, that this right to vote is still under attack.
Exactly. And so it just reminds us, John, that sometimes success is almost fleeting. You believe that you won a victory, and then you have to continue to kind of lift up the banner and issue the clarion call. And so in 2018, Florida voters voted by almost a two-thirds majority to restore voting rights to former felons, except for sex crimes and murder. And that would still have provided voting rights for over 1 million individuals. The voters passed the amendment, and we celebrated, and then subsequently received pushback from the governor and some of the legislators in the state house and even the Florida Supreme Court. And so there have been a number of appeals for that. I'm very happy to say that if we'd had this conversation last week, I wouldn't be able to say what I'm about to say. And that is as recently as this past Sunday, District Court Judge Hinkle issued his own plan after waiting for the governor to come up with a plan by which to determine whether some voters who should have been eligible to vote could or could not vote. And that was largely based on court fines, costs, restitutions, and that sort of thing. And so what Judge Hinkle determined by virtue of his own plan was in essence that those individuals who had court-appointed attorneys in particular were deemed indigent and therefore would not be able to pay those fines, thereby enabling them to vote. And so he both issued the fact that you could have a conversation about the fact that the plan could include the fact that you could say you couldn't pay, but at the same time paving a way so that having that conversation did not mean that voters would, in essence, not be able to meet the standard, the financial standard. And for the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center and so many of us, it really felt very much like a poll tax. And that was the essence of it. And so the governor, I believe, has already said that he is going to appeal the decision. But for now, there is certainly great rejoicing in the land around the restoration civil rights for these persons who have already paid their debt to society.
Well, thank you, Sharon, for both your continued work and witness and for helping us sort of center tonight's conversation in the long history of engagement by people of faith to secure and safeguard the right to vote. At the same time that Florida voters were going to the polls to vote on Amendment 4 that Sharon just mentioned, another important election was happening across the northern border in Georgia. And that midterm election in Georgia was the subject of the film Suppress, the Fight to Vote. I hope most of you were able to view it in advance of tonight's conversation, and we are so honored to be joined by the director of the film, Robert Greenwald. So Robert, welcome.
Thank you, nice to be with you.
And given that voter suppression has been a reality for generations in the US, your film focused specifically on the 2018 midterm election in Georgia. Can you share a little bit about what prompted you to focus on that election in making the film?
I didn't start out to make the film a full film. What happened is Brave New Films, for those of you who don't know, is a small nonprofit that creates films, creates short videos, all of it free, and it's available to schools and churches and bookstores and bowling alleys and any place libraries, any place you name. Every time we make a decision to do one subject, it means we're not going to get to do 10, 20, 30 others. So that's a key part of the process, figuring out what we want to do and how we want to do it. This film started out as maybe, I thought it'd be a 3 or 5 minute piece, collecting a few of the stories that we were seeing in the newspaper and on television about what had happened in Georgia. And as we did the research, and there's an amazing team at Brave New Films, story after story kept coming in. And I thought either I was in a time warp and it was back, 100 years, or I was in another country. And it was deeply, profoundly upsetting, troubling, and infuriating. I'm a New Yorker, so I have easy access to my rage, let me tell you. And it just grew. The stories grew the most. You saw the people in the film. These are patriots. These are people who believe in democracy. This is the real part of America that we don't see enough. And we all felt the responsibility to try to tell their story as well as we could, because when we did this film, the issue of voting suppression was not widespread. It was not understood. And I hope we've been able to play a role. There have been thousands of screenings of this film all around the country. Before COVID, it was in physical screenings, and now it's online. So our job with the film was to help make people aware. Now, we just finished, literally 2 days ago, Suppress 2020, which will be available for free to everybody in probably 2 weeks. We're finishing up some of the technical aspects. And that brings in much of what many of you may know or may not know, which is the issue of how COVID's affecting it and the increased systemic racist attacks using the voting system. We need to be really clear about it. The people in power are more terrified than ever. They're going to do more than ever to hold on to their jobs and their power. And they're going to do it by a horrific distortion of people's rights to vote. So the issue has become even more critical. And with a presidential election in front of us, the stakes are higher than they've ever been. And so the new version of the film, as I say, will be available, and hopefully you'll be able to use it and use it as an organizing tool, because these films are meant to create action. Look, I love going to the movie theaters when we used to be able to go to movie theaters. I love seeing it, on television, some service that I'm paying too much for. But the goal here is they're free and they're tools. There's the full film. There are clips from the film. There are sections from the film. There's a study guide. There's a reflection guide. We try to do as good a job as possible to make all parts of it available so that every one of you can use it in some way that you are comfortable with. And we're on every platform, from YouTube to Facebook to Twitter to we're now investigating TikTok, and it goes on and on.
That's great. So Robert, I appreciate that focus on moving towards action, and we'll certainly have spotlight on that in both the panel conversation next and our own Take Action. I'm wondering if you could, I know the film, and you just named this, it was so great at both sharing stories and then shining the spotlight on this, the insidious ways that racist policies are at work, not just in Georgia, but really across the US. Do you have advice that you would share from your experience, from the folks that you have been connected with, to those of us who are wanting to be stronger advocates to prevent what happened in 2018 from happening in future elections?
3 words: organize, organize, and organize. And there are many different ways to organize. There are many different groups. There are more people, again, rightfully so, concerned and focused on the issue. There are local groups, there are national groups, there are elected officials, there are lawsuits, there's a variety. And on our website, we provide links to some of them. I mean, you've mentioned some before. There's the ACLU, there's Stacey Abrams Group, Fair Fight, there's local groups in Georgia and groups around many of the states now where it is an important issue. I think the most important thing is that everybody understand there, in fact, is something you can do. Part of the systemic control and racism and the way the system has worked has tried to give us the message, oh, you really can't do anything, and it's the way it's been. Nonsense. Every single person, whether you're on social media, whether you have friends, whether you have enemies, whether you have relatives you like or you don't like, you have the ability to reach those people. And it's important. It's increasingly important as we go forward that each and every one of us do whatever we feel comfortable with. But there's always something to be done, and there's always an organization that fits who we are and what we're interested and how we think we can use our skills. Some people are terrified of the phone, so there's email. Some people hate email, so there's the phone. There's just so many different opportunities today that, there are many problems with social media, and we know that, but there's also extraordinary chances for us to influence 3 people, 5 people. You don't have to influence the whole country in one email or tweet.
Right. And I think that we're all living in a new reality of how we're connecting with friends, family, and others. And so I think there are both challenges to that, but also opportunities, as you named. So Robert, I hope you're able to stay for some of the questions that other participants might have. I wanted to thank you for your commitment to shining a light on both this and other social justice issues, for amplifying voices and sharing powerful stories, all with the goal of inspiring action. And
unfortunately, I am not able to stay because I have to go back to the most difficult part of my job, which is fundraising, which is why these are all free. But I'm happy to answer any questions. You can reach me on email, robert@bravenewfilms.org, or on Twitter. I'll be happy to follow up. And I want to thank you, John, and everyone for arranging this, and all the panelists. I'm sorry not to be able to stay right now, but I look forward to watching it on YouTube in the middle of the night. So
awesome. Thanks, Robert. And thanks for the heads up about the new film coming out, the update. Sure. Looking for that. So then the question for us is, how are we as people of faith to respond? So now we're going to turn to a conversation with 2 seasoned advocates, Reverend Dr. Anthony Everett and Sister Quincy Howard. Anthony, I wanted to start with you. Our United Methodist Social Teachings call for a vision of beloved community founded on economic and racial justice, and that as part of that vision includes reinstating and strengthening voting rights protections in light of continued systemic racism that threatens to undermine provisions for free and fair elections. Can you share with us how you have engaged with communities you've served in the struggle for voting rights, and how systemic racism is threatening to undermine free and fair elections?
Sure. Thank you, John. First, I want to state that just like Dr. Sharon Austin, I had parents that were always at the polls, always making sure that we would vote as well. And so my father was one that ingrained that in me. He was a poll watcher. And the last time he was a poll watcher before he passed was when Barack Obama won the first election. And so my father was actively engaged as an NAACP poll watcher. For me, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and so I got to see all the politics firsthand. And I was engaged in every election I could be engaged in. There was a local election. What came to me is, one of the things that came to me was very important, is that elections have consequences. And so being a Washington, D.C. native and knowing the struggle for statehood, that's been a major issue that we've been dealing with for a long time. And I know that you know that the House of Representatives just passed that, and the Senate is more than likely not going to pass that. But it's been ingrained in me, and so when I left Washington, D.C., I went to Flint, Michigan, lived there, wasn't in ministry at the time, but I was engaged in voting and engaged in that process. But it really hit me in terms of ministry when I went to Dallas, Texas, and I worked for, I was at St. Luke Community United Methodist Church under the Reverend Dr. Zan Holmes. And at that church, one thing that they did was they always had voter registration applications at the church, and that was just a basic to do that. But you had politicians in the church and people that were engaging everyone in the congregation to vote. And what I learned there was it's not important. It is important who you vote for, but however, we're not going to try to change your mind as to who you vote for. What's important is that you go out and vote and exercise that right before it's taken away from you. And so from there, leaving Dallas, Texas, going to Kentucky, being on the conference staff in the Kentucky Annual Conference, I got engaged in a number of different communities, the African-American communities, specifically in Louisville and Lexington. We had workshops that we were working with former felons to help them understand why their voting rights were being taken away from them. And then as well, we engaged people to go out and to attempt to get our felons to be able to vote, former felons to be able to vote, returning citizens. And so one of the things that we did, we pushed for House Bill 70, that was a few years ago, in the Kentucky State Legislature. And House Bill 70 was focused on returning those rights back to those who had been previously incarcerated. So we didn't win the fight at that time. However, more recently, the current governor has just passed that for former felons. So we've been able to have them exercise those rights. So in Kentucky, that's what I've done. But in Ohio, I got engaged with the NAACP, got my church engaged. I'm the first African-American pastor there. We had the NAACP meeting at our church for a number of years, but we never really engaged the NAACP. I said, well, why don't we do a partnership? Why don't you, especially in this COVID-19 time, work on doing a drive-by application drive, mail-in application drive, which is the way that a lot of states are trying to go right now. And there's a lot of pushback on that as well. And so we did that, and we were very successful at having people come in, drive in, fill out the applications, and in return, they would get a hot breakfast meal, and as well, they would receive a mask. And so they would go on about their ways. No interaction really, but we pretty much did that. I'm in Cleveland as my church. Right now, I'm in home in Kentucky, and I have been part of the voting that just took place here. It was a big race between two Democratic candidates, and Mitch McConnell was on the Republican side, so he won that hands down. But we know that come November, it's going to be extremely important to get people out to vote in this election. So it's one that is extremely important. And one of the points I want to make there is that the Secretary of State announced today how successful the mail-in voting happened, here in Kentucky. But he said that he doesn't think it will be that effective in November. Of course, he's a Republican, and so we've got to be on edge. We've got to watch out for those type of things. I'll end up my comments here with saying that we've got to educate. We got a coalition build. We've got to be advocates. One of the things in Kentucky that I did was when we had this House Bill 70, we would be at every legislative meeting talking about it and going up for that particular bill. And we would also be outside of some of the legislators' office on Wednesdays at noon. We would call it Witnessing Wednesdays. And we'd be there praying and singing and just, praising the Lord, but we'd be talking about voting rights. And so in any event, those are some of the things that we've done.
Great. Well, you've certainly covered a lot of geographic areas and pretty different ministry context. I'm wondering, as you're engaging with people of faith, and maybe you never encounter this, I know that I do at times, that there's somewhat a reluctance to engage in some issues around elections, around getting engaged, stepping out of our comfort zone maybe. What advice do you have for how to maybe encourage others and sort of overcome some of that reluctance or some of those barriers?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Well, actually, what I would really go to when we're talking people of faith believe in the Bible, or at least Christians believe in the Holy Bible. So, there are so many instances of Jesus Christ standing up against the injustices in the world at that particular time. And if we are Christians, we are modeling the life that Jesus Christ led. We're led by the Holy Spirit to do this. And so we can look at Luke 4:18-19, where it talks about Jesus providing sight to the blind and providing freedom, liberty to the oppressed, and setting the captives free. All of that entails being engaged in the political process. We can look at Paul, and Paul's entire life was running from place to place and being put in jail because he stood up against the powers that be. And at one point, he was a part of that system as a tax collector. We can go back to Moses, and Moses stood up against Pharaoh and said, hey, let my people go. And that was someone from a faith position standing up against the injustices that society had levied upon the rest of the world. So those are things I would say.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. So Sister Quincy, as Robert mentioned, as Anthony referenced, that we know that safeguarding the right to vote, ensuring a free and fair election has been an ongoing struggle, and that this year, the public health crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic is creating new risks and new concerns about different voter suppression tactics. Can you share with us the emerging concerns from your perspective and how we might address them to guarantee a safe, fair, and free election during a pandemic?
Sure. First, thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be on your panel today and to hear these amazing speakers. And also to work with you in Faithful Democracy. It's an honor to have a multi-faith coalition working together around improving our democracy, because Jewish, Muslim, Christian, all denominations, it is something that we share in common. Is a real concern for how our representative systems are functioning or not functioning for us. As far as the COVID pandemic is concerned, I think like so many other systems that we have, what COVID has done is laid bare the brokenness that was already there, much of it deeply rooted in systemic racism from the founding of our nation. We see it in healthcare, we see it in the labor structures and the labor force, and we also see it in our democracy and our election systems, as you saw in in the film Suppressed, this is not a new issue. It's really, COVID is just sort of a new twist on a historic systemic problem. And what has become apparent, I think, to a lot of Americans at this point, as Robert alluded to, there was somewhat of a dearth of awareness around how bad it had gotten around protecting voting rights since the Shelby ruling. And it's becoming really apparent from what we've seen in just the primaries in COVID that you cannot take for granted that your right to vote is going to be guaranteed or protected in this environment. The other dynamic that is new under COVID is that voting has become a potentially life-threatening thing. The implications are much more dire. Voting suppression, voting intimidation, that can mean making someone choosing between the right to vote and safeguarding their health. And the other sort of new twist to this already existing issue is that the barriers that, as we saw in Suppressed, could and often were written off as inconveniences, but create real barriers. Those have a new gravity now because they apply to everyone across the board and they are potentially life-threatening. So the barriers have become indiscriminate rather than discriminate as they have been throughout the history of our nation. So I think, like in so many other aspects of our society, COVID has been a real wake-up call to us. I think as far as the sort of new risks that are emerging, you saw in Suppressed how the act of voting is really a multi-step process, right? And every step there takes on new import in a pandemic because there is a potential need to interface with the public. So though every step has a new gravity of barrier potentially built into it, like registering, as Reverend Dr. Anthony alluded to, registration, you may have to go to the DMV, which is a place that people could be scared to expose themselves. Or casting your ballot in person, that means going to a poll station where there could be crowds. Or even absentee ballot could require in some states having a witness sign, which would mean having potential exposure from asking that witness to sign your ballot. So these are all sort of differences in the voting process under COVID-19 that are to be taken into consideration. But there's also other risks that are emerging and being seen as increasing risks to the 2020 election. One that I need to mention is the USPS. So the United States Postal Service is going to be what handles all of the absentee ballots in the 2020 election. And we know that even under the current administrative rules in different states, there's going to be a huge surge in demand. We've seen it in primaries already. There's no reason to believe that that is not going to also be the case in November. And we also know that USPS is hanging by a thread financially right now. They desperately need funding from Congress, emergency funding, to be able to maintain the capacity that they have and to, in turn, handle this surge in ballot demand come November. Another emerging issue is that as people are talking more and more about how mail-in ballots is, some people talk about it as the solution, right? This is the solution. People just mail in their ballots, it's all good. But we know that that is not going to be the solution for so many Americans for various reasons. Some people prefer to vote in person. Some people don't trust mail-in ballots. There's going to be a lot of displacement come November because of an economic crisis. Addresses are not necessarily going to stand when you have so many people that are being evicted from their homes. And we have in Native American communities and tribal lands, they don't even use the same kind of address system. So it presents its own set of complicating issues that need to be accommodated. And another sort of issue around polling places is that there are often crowds at polling places, especially on election day. So you really need to find ways to minimize how much people congregate there. This would be measures like extending early voting periods so that you can spread people out over time before election day to minimize how much they have to be around other people. And it's not just about waiting times, it's about literally about your safety. And then polling places are also going to need protective equipment and accommodations to just make sure that they are safe places for people to come to in a pandemic. And one thing that is really increasingly being recognized as a real potential issue for November is the poll workers themselves, because often the demographics of poll workers, volunteer or paid poll workers, is older Americans that fit solidly into higher risk groups. So what we have seen in the primaries, and many of them, is that poll workers have opted not to serve this year because they genuinely fear for their own safety. So there's going to be a real need for a new cadre of poll workers to come in and to be sufficiently trained to handle the election. Another emerging concern that I would be remiss not to flag is that it's going to take longer to get the election results this year. We have some estimates are weeks before the outcomes of the election are clear, depending on how close it might be. And I don't think that Americans have realistic expectations about that at this point. I hope that alarms are beginning to be raised and people are starting to understand that this is a different process that we're going to be using in our election this year, and that patience is going to be required. The final thing that I want to say about COVID, specific to the broader conversation with racial justice and voter suppression, is that the types of fixes and the funding that we are trying to get for this election in 2020 for emergency funding, it's not going to address the underlying issues of voter suppression that have been in our country since its founding. One example I would bring up is the Georgia election, which we all have seen images, and we will see the movie soon, it sounds like, of the fiasco that was the primary in Georgia and the lines that were miles long, and the rightful outrage across the country about what we saw, and also the lack of surprise that that is what happened in Georgia after what we had seen in 2018. What I would add is that once all the votes were tallied, there were some people that, and actually Reverend Dr. Anthony mentioned this also in Kentucky, that were saying what a success it was because of the voter turnout due to being able to vote by mail. In Georgia, I think it was 4 times the voter turnout from the 2016 primary, which would be the closest comparable numbers to look at. So it was 4 times that. So the voter turnout, it was a huge success. However, if you talk to those voters that were waiting in line that didn't end up getting to vote, or all of the people that didn't wait in line because they weren't able to spend that time in line, vast majority of which were voters of color, that election was not a success, and it did not address the issues that they've been dealing with for decades.
So thanks, Quincy. That was a really kind of comprehensive and alarming listing of vulnerabilities and challenges that we're facing. I know from our work together in Faithful Democracy that there are some ideas for how to address that, some good news in terms of solutions that we can plan for now in order to ensure a safe election in the fall. Can you maybe briefly share some of the top line ideas of how we could address some of the vulnerabilities?
Yeah, sure. And I think I alluded to some of them when I was talking about them. The first one, and like it is all hands on deck right now, what we need is money from Congress. That is the absolute necessity right now. And there's a diminishing window of time in which to receive that money and start pushing it down to states and local jurisdictions so that they can use it in a meaningful way to prepare for this election. We are asking Congress, and I've been lobbying with my multi-faith partners. We've been lobbying particularly Republicans in the Senate at this point to really push for $3.6 billion from the federal government in grants to states and local jurisdictions so that they can do things like be ready for the surge in mail-in ballots, be ready for hiring poll workers and training them, be ready to have the spaces for in-person polling stations, because we know that places like nursing homes, where sometimes they would have these stations, or community centers for the elderly, are not going to be good options. So there's a whole, and then there's also equipment that's needed to protect polling places. And all of these things take time, and we need the money now in order to begin those preparations, because local and state officials really need to have the confidence that there's going to be financial support for the steps that they are beginning to move into. Mm-hmm. So those are sort of the solutions, so to speak, for what is needed at this time. As far as individual people of faith in your communities, I would say contact your senators is number one, and sound the alarms to people that you know about the need for this financing. And then find out, because local jurisdictions and states all have their own rules, find out what your rules are, find out what the problems are in your area, and talk to your circle. This was alluded to before. Talk to your circle of acquaintances, all the people that you know. Tell them that absentee ballot voting is not as straightforward as going to the polls. It takes time. There are deadlines involved, and it's a multi-step process in and of itself. So those are sort of the steps for this election. I would say, however, that I am really hopeful about this election, quite honestly. I know that we had elections in the Civil War. We had elections in the Great Depression. Like, this is something that we can do. We are capable of doing this. What I would caution people of faith to do is, after this election is successful and we carry forward with a new administration, or the next administration, is not to become complacent and let our democratic systems go back on autopilot, because they are very deeply broken. One of the things that Faithful Democracy, one of our goals, is really the deeper, bolder, more comprehensive democracy reforms that would get at things like systemic racism, money in politics, the partisan dysfunction that is driving us all crazy. That makes our democracy really dysfunctional, and is really all of the other issues that people of faith care about: reducing poverty, affordable healthcare, reducing gun violence, curbing climate change. All of these things, change is going to depend on having a functional and truly representative democracy. So continue the fight and the struggle to make those reforms even after this coming election.
Great. Thank you, Quincy. And in a moment, we're going to turn to questions that you all have as participants. So again, if you haven't already, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to input your questions. Before we turn to those questions, I do want to invite Reverend Jeannie Moore to share with us a real tangible way that we might put our faith into action. Quincy kind of teed it up, the urgency of contacting our members of Congress right now, asking for particular financing. So Jeannie, if you could share with us the invitation to action.
Sure, John. And first, let me just say thank you to all of our panelists and speakers this evening for raising this vital issue of voter suppression and contextualizing it for us in this moment right now. So as we know from our own lives, from ongoing elections and tonight's discussion, the right to vote is neither secured nor safe. Voter suppression efforts were underway long before the current COVID pandemic. However, the coronavirus pandemic has compounded the obstacles and provided cover to the ongoing nefarious, racist, and discriminatory voter suppression efforts, further threatening an already precarious and under-resourced system. As United Methodists, we hold governments responsible for the protection of the rights of the people to free and fair elections, and we believe that the form and the leaders of all governments should be determined by the exercise of the right to vote guaranteed to all adult citizens. And that's a direct quote from our Book of Discipline, paragraph 164A. With that stated, we need to act on that belief. So I invite you to join us by contacting your elected officials to demand that they safeguard the right to vote for all adult citizens and provide the resources necessary to protect voters and election workers at risk from the COVID-19 pandemic. No one should be forced to choose between faithful civic engagement and their health. So, on our website, www.umcjustice.org, you will find an action alert where you or anyone else can write and send a letter to your members of Congress. A sample letter is provided, and it has a template for calling on your members of Congress to support $4 billion for the Election Assistance Commission and states and territories to ensure safe, accessible, and secure elections. These funds will support no excuse absentee voting with prepaid postage, extended voter registration, including same-day and online registration, and election contingency plans to protect the health and safety of poll workers and voters who vote in person. So essentially, all of the measures that Reverend Dr. Anthony and Sister Quincy and others have referenced this evening. The link to this action alert will be included in the follow-up email, so that will be sent to everyone who registered. And you can also, again, easily find the action on our website homepage. I want to thank you in advance for acting on your faith and acting on what, the issue that we've been presented with this evening, we've been discussing. We can make a difference. And so with that, I will turn it back to Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you to all of our panelists and all of you who have been tuning in for this hour. We want to turn now to ask your questions that have come in through the question and answer. Given our limited time, we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. But we will, as Jeannie said, offer a follow-up resource email, and we will try to address your questions through that channel. Sister Quincy, I have a question for you. And this is a question that comes in about voter suppression in specific states. The question is, in what US states are voter suppression most egregious? In which of these states is litigation still in process? And what can I do as a person of faith to engage in the fight to stop such horrific actions by government officials in those states? Sister Quincy?
Yes, I so appreciate that question. I would say that many of the states that have a history of voter suppression are the same states that were identified in the Voting Rights Act through their Section 5, I believe their formula for preclearance. And the reason that they were included in the Voting Rights Act is because there was such evidence of heinous voter suppression that it was undeniable that there was an intentionality about it. These tend to be southern states. Georgia, I would be remiss not to mention, Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama. I don't want to start naming states that might not be included, but I think folks tend to get the picture on states that are problematic. There's for this election, what I would recommend is tapping into an organization called Reclaim Our Vote, which is very intentionally part of the problem with the Shelby ruling is that there's not any redress for the injustices that you're talking about until after the election. So you've lost your vote, but then you can sue. What Reclaim Our Vote is trying to do, they have several different tools, including a very basic postcard writing campaign that are targeting these states that are known to be the most problematic and trying to get out in front of the suppressive efforts. Things like they know that there's a lot of people that are potentially going to be purged from voting rolls. They'll send out postcards to these people saying, hey, you might want to check your registration to make sure everything is in order, to flag for them the fact that this is going on. So they're really, in a very intentional way, targeting those states and trying to get ahead of the suppression or counteract the suppression. And on the long term, what I would say is push, advocate, lobby for the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is HR 4. It's already passed the House. It's stuck in Mitch McConnell's graveyard right now. This is the bill that would restore the Voting Rights Act and strengthen the enforcement piece of the Voting Rights Act that has been sorely missing since 2013.
Thank you, Sister Quincy. Many people have wondered about the level of voter fraud in elections. Particularly, this has been raised by some concerning mail-in ballots, the reliability. How worried should we be about voter fraud?
Is this to me?
Yes.
Okay. I would say voter fraud is the least of our worries, to be quite honest. People have been voting, absentee voting for decades, and 25% of the American population has participated in absentee voting. There are safeguards in place, barcodes, tracking devices, signature verification on your envelopes. There's all kinds of safeguards in place. And the real worry around vote by mail is to have the capacity to meet the need. It's not the voter fraud. And I would say that the narratives that have been thrown around about the fraudulent nature of vote by mail is quite counterproductive and dangerous. It's counterproductive because what new studies are showing is that actually the judgment around vote by mail that a lot of Republicans have, it's preventing them from participating in the voting process. And so while for Democrats, the numbers may be going up for how they're participating by vote and mail, there's evidence that Republicans are actually refraining from voting because they're concerned about that process, which is, I don't think, a valid concern. And the other danger about that narrative is, I alluded earlier to the delays that are gonna be inevitable unless there's a landslide election. It's very likely that there's going to be a delayed results announcement. And the more that people's doubts and suspicions about our election, the more that's fed into, it really could potentially sow discord around the outcome of the election and the validity of the outcome. But the voter fraud itself, I genuinely feel like that is the least of our worries in this election.
Thank you, Sister Quincy. That's all the time we have for questions for now, but as I noted, we will make sure that we are able to answer your questions as best we can through our follow-up email. I'll turn it now back to John.
Great, thank you, Jesse. And thanks again to all of our participants, all of our panelists. As Jesse mentioned, in the coming days, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email with a link that includes both a recording of this webinar, a link to the action that Jeannie Rhee highlighted, as well as additional resources. We'll be sure to include information like Quincy mentioned about Reclaim Our Vote and other ways that we as people of faith can equip ourselves for engagement. So unfortunately, we are at the end of our time together. I hope and trust that you found this conversation both as challenging and inspiring as I have. And I would invite you to share what you have learned tonight. Robert made the great point of inviting our family, our friends, our neighbors into this conversation. So you can share a recording of the webinar, the links that we'll send, the invitation to action, so that together we can build a powerful movement of people of faith who are committed to safeguarding the right to vote and ensuring safe, fair, and free elections. So thank you all for joining. I look forward to continuing the conversation after this webinar and working together to safeguard the right to vote. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a good night.
Thank you so much.